Stephen, I think are you ready? All right. Here it goes.
1 second there, Hugh.
Okay. Okay. Good morning.
Good morning, Hugh.
Good morning, Jeff. Bienvenue à Wolfville, à l'Université Acadia. My name is Hugh Chipman. I'm chair of the Local Arrangements Committee. Avant de commencer l'allocution d'invité du président, nous avons quelques remarques d'ouverture and annonces à faire. At this time, I'd like to ask Acadia's President and Vice Chancellor, Ray Ivany, to say a few welcoming words on behalf of Acadia University.
Thank you very much, Hugh, and it's wonderful for Acadia to be hosting the conference. We hope you enjoy the campus and enjoy the community despite the weather. This is not typical, I'm sure you've heard this already, but this is not typical for the Annapolis Valley this time of year. There are a couple of things I'd like to say and welcome you to the university. Some of the audience, I suspect, will know Acadia. We're one of the few remaining small, primarily undergraduate universities in Canada that have kept a long and deep tradition. The university is 172 years old. Of a commitment as a teaching institution, but also one that heavily values research. That places an inordinate demand on our faculty, quite frankly, and many of you from smaller institutions will understand that. What sustains this university is a culture that's been created that outstanding faculty who want to maintain a teaching program, who want to involve undergraduates in their research. And yes, we produce many peer-reviewed articles each year between our faculty and undergraduate students. And build a sense of community around a very, very deep and rich undergraduate experience. So the university has been committed to that since its very founding, and we proudly try to maintain that tradition up until today. I especially want to note, and I think it's entirely appropriate, I want to thank Dr. Chipman not only for hosting the committee, but also for those of you that know Hugh, and perhaps more importantly for those that don't, for his contribution to that culture that I just described. And the Chipman name has been attached to this university since its earliest days. But for those that don't know, Hugh is the Canada Research Chair in Mathematical Modeling at Acadia and is one of those exemplars of a faculty member that has maintained a strong research program, highly connected with undergraduate students, and does a few other things in the community as well. Anybody involved in the scouting movement will know that too. But there really is something quite magical. I've only been at the university for 2 years. I can tell you that I've known it for a long time, but once you're here, you discover that trying to be as good as we want to be in that space does take an extraordinary commitment, and I want to acknowledge Hugh for that. And many of his colleagues, but he is an outstanding representative of our university. It's not often that you say a welcome and you also say a second thank you, but I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't thank you and the profession that you represent in having the courage to speak of your convictions around the issue last year on the long-form census. And I realize that'll be a topic of discussion shortly, but simply as a Canadian, I was very proud of the country because there was such a deep debate around that issue. And it simply wouldn't have happened if many, and I suspect some in this room, did not have the courage to speak out and to raise that issue. And I think it speaks volumes about our country that actually there was much resonance in the response to those positions that you took. So a thank you simply as a citizen of this wonderful country. So again, have a fabulous proceedings over the next number of days. If there's anything that we can do to make your stay better or more enjoyable, please let us know. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Local Arrangements Committee, I have a few announcements. Au nom du comité des arrangements locaux, j'ai quelques annonces. Comme ce sont des annonces de dernière minute, je les ferai en anglais. Je sais que Terry Duchesne, le président des arrangements locaux dernière, se fera un plaisir de décoder mes divulgations pendant la pause café. Terry, j'espère que tu es dans la salle ce matin. Ah, voilà, merci. Although the President said some kind words about me, I would be very remiss if I did not acknowledge the very strong team here at Acadia that did the local arrangements. There were 7 of us who worked very hard on this, and it was really a great experience working on this. So they worked very hard on this, and I think I'd like to acknowledge them all right now. A few other announcements. I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors. We had generous support from both the institutes, the university, and also Minitab, who are providing these lanyards. Lunch is included with your registration. The cafeteria is in Wheelock Hall, up the hill from here. You'll need swipe cards included in your registration package to get into the dining hall. Before you leave Wolfville, please return them to the checker at the dining hall or at the registration desk. Coffee breaks will be in this building, the Festival Theatre. Parallel sessions are across the street in the Beverage Arts Center, or BAC. Volunteers will be wearing shirts like mine. They'll be more than happy to answer any of your questions. A sheet with last-minute changes to the program is available at the registration desk and is posted on the notice board beside the registration desk. I thought it would also be appropriate to tell you when the tide is low and high today. This is a picture of the Wolfville Harbor, and if you were there at 5 o'clock this morning, it would look like the first picture. And if you go there at 11 o'clock, it'll look like the second one. The Wolfville Harbor is down by the Tim Hortons. It's at the other end of town, about an 8-minute walk or so. Les organisateurs locaux vous souhaitent un excellent congrès à Wolfville. I'd like to now call on our President, Don McLeish, to make some announcements and the awards.
Bienvenue au congrès 2011 de la SSC. Je tiens également à présenter les membres du comité scientifique de ce congrès qui, je suis certain, sera un congrès merveilleux. Special thanks to the program chair, Shelley Bull, without whom, of course, this meeting would be very short. Shelley, where are you? Could you stand up for a second? So, there. And meetings coordinator, Duncan Murdoch, without whom there'd be hardly any meetings at all. Speaking of meetings, I'd like to remind you of the annual general meeting, which will be held today at 5:30 to 6:30. That's important because without a quorum, there will be no meetings and no society. So don't forget to attend that if at all possible. John Tukey once said, the best thing about being a statistician is that you get to play in everyone's backyard. This is really, in short, what this meeting is about. Embracing and celebrating activity across the whole spectrum of the statistical sciences, from the most esoteric to the supremely practical. And we will begin here by recognizing those that played most effectively, sometimes with others and sometimes alone, but always with great creativity, the award winners. I will ask you to hold your applause until they've all been introduced. Il me fait grand plaisir de vous présenter les gagnants des principaux prix de la SSC. Je vous demande cependant de retenir vos applaudissements jusqu'à ce que tous les gagnants aient été présentés. Prix déjà annoncé. The Prix CRM SSA is for mid-career distinction, 15 years after a PhD, and this prize goes to Edward A. Susko from Dalhousie University. He will speak Wednesday in the Festival Theater here, I guess, at 1 o'clock, so you will have a chance to see his address then. The Prix Pierre Robillard for the best thesis in statistics in 2010 goes to Gun-Ho Zhang for a thesis entitled Invariant Procedures for Model Checking for Prior Data Conflict and Bayesian Inference. He did his thesis at the University of Toronto under the direction of Michael Evans. The CJS Best Paper Award for 2010 goes to Isabel Molina and J.N.K. Rao, who some of you may know, and for a paper called Small Area Estimation of Poverty Indicators. Of course, as you all know, these awards will be honored once again at the banquet. We'll read the citations at that time. Let me now proceed to the so-called senior awards. This is no reference to the age of those who receive the awards. And the first of which, Prix pour service insigne à la SSA. And this prize goes to a friend and distinguished contributor to the SSC, David A. Binder. The award for the impact of applied and collaborative work goes to Francis Spears at the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium, University of Victoria, Victoria, British Columbia. Let me introduce the honorary member for the SSC. This award winner, unfortunately, is not able to be with us here, at least physically. The award winner is Constance Van Eden, variously at the Université de Montréal, Université du Québec à Montréal, and University of British Columbia. Presently in the Netherlands, and if you'll forgive me for a moment, she's unable to be here. The banquet is held at 2 o'clock in the morning. Unfortunately, we could have moved the banquet for her benefit, but she's unable to acknowledge the receipt of the prize at that time. So if you'll forgive me, I will try and put her online. Constance, are you there? Constance, hello. Oh, the volume would make a difference. Can you hear us, Constance? Okay.
Hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. So if you'd like to say something now, that would be great. Since you can't do so at the banquet, I'm in front of a room of many people, all of whom are full of congratulations. So she's absolutely speech-struck. And I would be too if I received this award.
Hold on, I'm not speaking. I can't hear you anymore.
You can't see me.
No, I've gotten rather in 1 minute when it's missing. Let's go ahead.
Well, Constance, if you're still there, let me read the citation. And then I'm afraid we're not getting a... Oh, this is dangerous. This is very dangerous. I want you all to close your eyes for a second while I go to the citation. The citation, Constance, reads, to Constance Van Eden for fundamental and pioneering work in nonparametric statistics and estimation for restricted parameter spaces, for her high standards in research, in particular numerous editorial contributions in Canada and elsewhere, for generously mentoring and inspiring many generations of statisticians.
Thank you.
Absolutely welcome. I think we can... Thank you very much for being with us electronically, Constance. We will re-announce this award at the banquet. We'll all congratulate you, so if you have pleasant dreams tomorrow night, that will be the reason.
Can I still say something?
You can say something, yes?
Hey, okay, then I'll do so. Thank you very much for the SSC for awarding me this. These are, of course, to my colleagues who's making did a lot of work to write this nice citation, a nice summary of my work. And of course, I thank for the proposed me to the SSC. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Constance. And last but surely not least, that's very ominous. Turn down the volume. The last of these senior awards, the Médaille d'Or, the gold medal recipient this year is M. Christian Genet from McGill University, Montreal, Quebec. And I think that ends the awards, and you may congratulate all of the winners with your applause. Permettez-moi de vous présenter une personne qui a grandement influencé la statistique pendant plus qu'un demi-siècle et qui continue d'influencer même en étant à la retraite. Il est un statisticien d'éloquence et de courage. En 1956, il quitte sa Hongrie natale pour venir s'établir au Canada et commence sa carrière au Bureau fédéral de la statistique. Travaillant de jour et étudiant de soir, il devient en 1958 le premier étudiant de l'université Carleton à obtenir une maîtrise en sciences. 3 ans plus tard, il répète l'exploit et devient le premier diplômé au doctorat de l'université Carleton. Let me introduce a person who has greatly impacted statistics over the last 50 years and more, and who continues to do so in what, for more mortal statisticians, is sometimes referred to as retirement. He's a statistician of eloquence and courage, perhaps not surprisingly, given that he came to Canada from Hungary shortly after the crushing of the 1956 Hungarian uprising. He arrived in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada that year and soon began working for the Dominion Bureau of Statistics. Completing his degree part-time, he became the first Carleton student to receive a Master of Science degree in 1958 and then Carleton's first PhD graduate in 1961. The year he was appointed Director of Sampling, Research and Consultation Staff and then Director General of the Methodology and Systems Branch in 1971. He was promoted to Assistant Chief Statistician in 1973 and Deputy Chief Statistician in 1984. Le 1er septembre 1985, Ivan Falegi était nommé statisticien en chef du Canada. 23 ans plus tard, soit le 15 février 2008, il annonçait sa retraite. He's the recipient of far too many honors and awards to fit into a short introduction. Member and then officer of the Order of Canada, honorary member of the International Statistical Institute and the SSC, Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society, Order of Merit of the Republic of Hungary, La Médaille de la Ville de Paris, member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, Gold Medal by the Statistical Society of Canada, and the Robert Schuman Medal for the European Community. He served as Chair, Conference of European Statisticians of the United Nations, Economic Commission for Europe, President of the International Statistical Institute, the International Association of Survey Statisticians, Statistical Society of Canada, you may have heard of, Chair of the Board of Governors, Carleton University. And in addition, he holds honorary doctorates from the Université de Montréal, Université de Québec, the Simon Fraser University, McMaster, Carleton University, and the University of Ottawa. Nevertheless, rather than rest on this virtual truckload of laurels in retirement, when the long-form census was canceled last year, Ivan Falegi was the first to throw himself into the discussion. His arguments for information-based policy were singular for their informed, reasonable, and logical tone. He's published extensively on statistical methods, on the social and economic applications of statistics, and on the successful management of statistical agencies. Once again, and with great pleasure, I introduce this year's Statistical Society of Canada Presidential Address given by Dr. Ivan Falegi. De l'adresse présidentielle de la SSC.
Thank you very much. After that introduction, it can only be downhill, so bear with me. Nothing illustrates my dedication and devotion to you all than the fact that at this ungodly hour I'm here and talking to you. Being in retirement, one of the benefits is that one can choose not only what one works on, but the time at which one works on. Anyway, my topic, not too surprisingly, is about the lessons that I'd like to derive from the incident of the 2011 Canadian census. Let me start with an anecdote. In the early 1990s, when Eastern Europe was throwing off the shackles of the communist regime and establishing democratic systems, those of us who came from developed countries, and Canada was certainly one of those, sat around the table in Europe and thought about how we could help these newly developing democracies in the area of statistics. They were called transition countries. And somebody came up with it wasn't me, but somebody came up with the idea that we should establish some fundamental principles of official statistics and basically tell them how this is done in countries that know how to do it. And I was kind of initially poo-pooing the idea. This is something that has to grow, and you can't just tell people how to do it, and you have to establish the tradition and so on. But then I went along with it. I thought it might be some merit, really, in articulating what are the underlying values that we all share and we want to advocate. And so I was one of the founders and framers of what came to be known as the UN Fundamental Principles of Official Statistics. But I remember the smugness and sense of superiority that I felt at the time, articulating these principles for the poor buggers who need to be told, who don't just intrinsically know it. Well, I no longer have that sense of superiority, and I'll come back to the UN fundamental principles as something that we need to adopt and we need to advocate. But first, let me give you some background about Statistics Canada and the Statistics Act under which we operate. The very important point I want to emphasize that there is the law and then there is the tradition, and as in many Anglo-Saxon, culturally Anglo-Saxon countries, tradition is as important as the law. Under the law, Statistics Canada is a department, a ministère comme les autres. It operates under a minister, and the minister has full authority over the operation of the agency. The minister has a deputy called the Chief Statistician of Canada, and that's what the law says. By tradition, however, all the relevant decisions were made by Statistics Canada, and specifically nominally, of course, at least by the Chief Statistician, within a budget that was annually established by the government for Statistics Canada. An explicit exception to this tradition, very strongly established tradition of independence, has been not just nominally, but actually has been that the census questions, every census, were approved by the government. Not the methods of census taking, not what we would publish, not how we would process the data, nothing about the technical side, but what are the questions that are appropriate to put to Canadians. Now, what's also part of the background that I want to just briefly mention, because it's not all that well known. It's well known that there is now a long form, or there used to be for many years, a long form and a short form census. But by tradition, there didn't used to be a separation of those two. There was only a long form census. And again, this is sometimes not understood. People sometimes think that there used to be only a short form census, and somehow the long form was an addition. It's the other way around. Traditionally, there was only one census, and it was long. There were some censuses that had more than 100 questions. I think the highest was even 200-some questions. It was in 1971, and actually at my instigation, that we said, well, not all of this has to be asked of everybody in Canada. Let's decide what we need to ask of everybody. That became known as short form. And what doesn't have to be asked of everybody and can be asked on a sample basis. And at some point it was started out as 1 in 3, and then it became 1 in 5, where most of the content of the census was collected from that kind of a sample. Very successful. Cabinet, as I say, decided the content, with very rare exceptions in my whole career, usually accepting Statistics Canada's recommendations, which in turn, of course, were based on very wide-ranging consultations with users about what they needed. And quite explicitly, everything else was decided by Statistics Canada, again, based on very wide-ranging consultations. A little bit of a space problem here for paper and computer. Now, coming to the recent events. In the summer of 2010, Cabinet decided to make the long form voluntary. This was announced on a Friday afternoon, just before a long weekend. Usual government pattern when something is hoped to be just slipped by an unsuspecting public. And What I was worried about, of course, and what I'll be talking about quite a bit, is something that I don't need to elaborate for you, and that's the bias. The fact that the long form is going to be voluntary, it's no longer called a long form. In fact, I should open a parenthesis and say that was another kind of not quite fair way of proceeding about this, that the Statistics Act quite explicitly makes it legal to have voluntary surveys and compulsory surveys both. But it makes an exception for the census, and it says the census may not be voluntary. So in order to get around this problem, what used to be the long form of the census has been renamed the National Household Survey. It's no longer called the census. Wouldn't matter very much, of course, if the responses were distributed at random. But although we know very little about biases in general, we know enough about it to know that typically people with lower levels of education and income are less likely to respond to voluntary surveys, that Aboriginal persons are less likely to respond, that recent immigrants, generally vulnerable groups, are less likely to respond, the elderly living alone. But at the other extreme of the income distribution, the very rich also are less likely to respond. And of course, the worst part about the bias is that I say it lurks. It's there. We know it's very likely to be there, but we don't know how big, and sometimes we don't even know its direction. Oh, I skipped. I should have mentioned that the long form, which has now been renamed the National Household Survey, in my view, is still a census. It is taken by the census staff. It has all the traditional census questions. It has the dissemination plan that we used in the 2006 census. And in my mind, something that looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck is a duck. Now, the impact on users of census data, I could talk to you at length, but I'll just read for you one of the best articles on this that was written by, in the Hill Times by a journalist called Armini Alnesian. She said, without this information, we cannot make informed decisions about where to plan the next extension of public transit or where to target different types of health resources. In the event of a health pandemic, there will be insurmountable challenge in prioritizing emergency response. Education is key to everyone's future, but we won't know where the best educational outcomes are occurring across neighborhoods, cities, and provinces, and what drives the differences. Communities will not be able to identify the areas of greatest need for the next after-school program, immigrant settlement service, or child care center. Police will be unable to recruit a labor force that best matches the communities they serve. Canadian entrepreneurs won't be able to target the best markets for launching a product or service. Investors won't know where demand is heading without reliable data on the changing demographics of the marketplace. Charities won't be sure whether they are addressing today's needs and tomorrow's problems. Politicians won't have the information they need to follow the changing contours of their constituencies. We won't be certain how the current generation of new Canadians will compare to the generations that came before, a huge issue for a country that will lean heavily on immigration in the years to come. We will have little sense beyond anecdote of how First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities are faring in their journey towards economic security and human development. We will only be guessing about the nature of the fallout from the Great Recession. Did inequality grow, and if so, by how much and where? Who was impacted most by downturns, and how widespread were the effects? From neighborhoods to municipality, region, and nation, the census provides a snapshot of who we are, what is changing, and what needs to change. That picture is accurate because it is mandatory. The knowledge it offers forms the backbone of our society, an information society that needs and wants to know about itself. So that was her, I thought, excellent summary of why the census is crucial information. Now, the key problems for all users are, as I mentioned, first of all, the unknown quality of the census. But an even bigger problem is the comparability with earlier censuses. There clearly will be a break. We go about it in a fundamentally different way. And most important questions are not the questions about how many there are of some kind of group, but how they are changing. And that we will fundamentally not be able to address with confidence. Some of the data will undoubtedly be good, and some of it will not be good. But we won't be able to help very much in determining which is which. And furthermore, the problem, if it's unaddressed, will become worse over time. Because in 2011, we have the data of 2006 as a benchmark to use A as estimation tools, or aids, but B as comparators. If the change is too big, it's kind of surprising and unlikely to be true. But the further away we get from the last good measure, 2006, the less we will be able to take advantage of these tools. Now, in addition to the unfortunate nature of the decision, the manner of making the decision was also unfortunate. There was absolutely zero consultation with users, experts, provinces, private sector, public sector. Nobody was consulted. Least of all, as far as I know, Statistics Canada. Well, at least it was consulted, but it wasn't listened to. The Statistical Society of Canada, the American Statistical Association, the French statisticians formally took a position against this decision, and I want to take this opportunity to thank SSC for doing so. That doesn't surprise me all that much, because we, of course, know what bias is and how pernicious it can be. But I was surprised, very pleasantly, by the public reaction and its strength, including some 50 cities and towns representing well over 80% of the population, ranging from east to west, banks, financial institutions, health organizations, churches, labor unions, think tanks, including from the left of center to the right of center, pollsters, and so on. Again, if I may, I'd like to quickly take another journalist and say how he viewed the public reaction. And this was Jeffrey Simpson, one of the most respected columnists in Canada. He wrote, and I'm just excerpting what he said. "It's been a fine summer for Canadian democracy. No, not parliamentary democracy, since Parliament was not in session. No, it's been a fine summer because civic society overwhelmingly rose up against the assault on reason and the ephemeral triumph of ideology over fact reflected in the Harper government's destruction of Statistics Canada's long-form census. The Harper government tried to slip a fast one past Canadians. It announced the end of the long form in the dead of summer on a Friday to boot. They must have figured no one would be paying attention, so they could take on their dislike of Statistics Canada when no one was looking. A dislike grounded in their blinkered belief that the agency collects facts that are then used by pressure groups, often the social activist variety, that want more and bigger government. Imagine, every religious group opposed the Harper assault, as did business organizations representing everything from Bay Street to mom-and-pop stores, universities, trade unions, social groups, aboriginals, minority language groups. The list goes on and on. I won't go on reading the article, but essentially, you have the flavor of it. I'll go through just one more aspect of the manner of making this decision because it sheds light on my next theme for this talk. And that had to do with the minister's defense of this decision, the minister responsible for Statistics Canada. Initially, he defended it on the basis of privacy. But then it turned out, and as the journalists started to probe, that there was a vanishingly small number of complaints against the census. There were officially 3 complaints to the Privacy Commissioner over a period of 10 years, and even in terms of letters to Statistics Canada, there were a few dozen out of the millions of questionnaires we mailed out. So that became kind of untenable, and as time went on and the pressure didn't abate, the minister increasingly started to invoke the good name of Statistics Canada. In fact, at one point, he quite explicitly implied that he just chose one of the options offered to him by Statistics Canada as good and viable options. And he added something like, well, you know Statistics Canada, you can trust them. They are professionals. If they gave me an option, it has to be viable. He went on to add, when the pressure still continued, that, well, Statistics Canada thinks they are independent, but they work for me. I make the decisions. Both of those things can't be both simultaneously true, but he said both of them. At this point, the chief statistician of the time, wasn't me, resigned. That was a very significant event. In living memory, there has not been a deputy minister who had to resign on a point of principle. So this was a very high-profile decision. The government held, in spite of the public pressure, to its line, except for one thing. It blinked when a group of people who, on language grounds, threatened to sue, in fact, did sue the government and wanted to take the issue all the way, perhaps up to the Supreme Court. At that point, the government blinked, and it transferred the language questions from what it initially intended, which was to be on this long form, which is now called the National Household Survey, and it transferred it to the short form, which is compulsory and goes to everybody. I'll come back to that again because it's significant. But I want to move on to my next theme. Why did the chief statistician resign? Well, he made it quite clear why he resigned. It wasn't because of the census decision as such. He was a loyal public servant, and so long as the government said, look, we are the government, we decided that the long form will be voluntary from now on, and you just go ahead and do it. That's your order. If that had been the line, he was not happy, but he was ready to just implement it as a good public servant. But when the government actually implied, fairly explicitly, the minister at least, that this was supported by Statistics Canada, then he felt he had no choice but to resign. He felt that the chief statistician had a critical role as protector of public confidence in official statistics, and if the public believed that Statistics Canada supported this methodological decision, in an earlier version of my slides I had methodological nonsense, but I took it out because I'm a moderate person. He felt it would have undermined confidence in the institution, and confidence is crucial. Why is public confidence so fundamental in official statistics? Well, most of the uses of Statistics Canada can be categorized, I think, under 4 broad headings. The first of those headings I call democratic accountability. Most of what we know about the country that is quantified comes from official statistics. Obviously, from kind of trivial issues like whether the recession is getting deeper or easing, we have a sense, you can say, well, we don't really need official statistics. We know when the recession is bad and we know when it's getting better. But of course, the precise turning point, we don't know from anecdotal evidence or from our own personal experience. And it's quite important for policy setting by the Bank of Canada or others. We know that the price of eggs or bread or anything we buy very often, how fast it changes, but that of course doesn't reflect inflation necessarily. You have to put it together with things we don't buy very often, like housing or cars or other major investments. And it's only the composite of those that gives a reasonable picture of how fast the inflation is changing. And that comes from official statistics. Unemployment, naturally. But these are fairly obvious examples, but there are less obvious examples. Is Aboriginal education catching up to the Canadian average or not? We don't have a sense of that unless it comes from official statistics. Economic integration of immigrants is one of the major issues of Canada. We are a country of immigrants, and we are bringing in typically 200,000 to 300,000 immigrants a year in the last several years. And one of the experiences, one of the reports of Statistics Canada, one of the very insightful researches that we carried out was to show that with each new cohort of immigrants arriving in Canada, they do worse and worse, not just at the time of their arrival, but for the next 10 years over catching up to the Canadian level of living. Is that getting better or worse after the Great Recession? We don't know. There are some very slowly evolving phenomena that are crucial for Canadian identity. For example, French language and its status in Quebec, outside Quebec, in language minority areas. No other source of information has the accuracy and the sample size needed to give a picture of that kind of question. I could go on and give example after example, income polarization, and so on. Clearly, these are some of the fundamental questions that face Canada. And the government's democratic accountability, in a real sense, is accomplished through information coming from official statistics. If there was any question and any doubt about whether or not those kinds of measures are independent and trustworthy, clearly democratic accountability as a function of official statistics would come to an end, wouldn't be viable. A second broad group of uses of information from official statistics is for evidence-based decision-making. When I say evidence-based decision-making, I don't imply and don't even mean to imply, even remotely, that evidence is the only basis on which decisions are or should be made. There is intuition, there are values, there is a whole range of other kinds of information. But I certainly do imply and assert that evidence should be considered as one of the inputs to decision-making wherever evidence is available. It's a question of rational use of resources. And again, it's not only governments that use evidence-based decision-making, but from banks that adjust their risk tolerances on the basis of evidence, decisions about enterprise locations, business outlets, transportation planning, and so on, all the lists that Arminianesian's article mentioned. Who would base hugely consequential decisions on data that could not be trusted? That could not be trusted not only to be accurate, but to be free of value biases. A third broad category of uses of official statistics is for research. We have established almost 30 research data centers in different universities, which published almost 1,000 papers from a whole range of topics that are listed on that slide. Critical element of evidence of critical element of information being usable for research is replicability, of course. If the information cannot be replicated, and I don't think the kind of information that will come from a voluntary long-form census is replicable necessarily, because it's so social context dependent, it's questionable whether or not that information will in fact be usable for research. The last and fourth category is what is least well known and what I call honest information brokering. There are in fact billions of dollars changing hands, not just between governments, but between private sector players, that are directly and formula-wise dependent on official statistics. The indexing of labor contracts and pensions, the federal provincial transfers, equalization payments. Much of our private enterprise long-term contracts are indexed to inflation measures or of one sort or another. For example, give you an example, I know that one of the major aerospace companies in Canada, when it sells abroad over a long-term period transportation equipment, and it receives payment over many years, those payments are indexed to Canadian CPI data. For all of these trust-based uses of information, let me just make one more comment before I come to my last point here on the slide. Clearly, if there was the slightest evidence, for example by the provinces, that the federal government can manipulate data on which these billions of dollars are transferred, that whole social arrangement would become unstuck. It simply wouldn't be tenable. The main point I'm trying to make is this. Very few users can verify the data directly. And if you can't verify the data, you must trust the provider, or else it's really not usable. Now, what are the elements of trust? Why trust comes about or is lost? It's the result of several traits. Clearly, protection of confidentiality is fundamental. Methodological competence is obviously crucial. Professional integrity, trustworthiness is clearly essential. That includes being open about errors. And Statistics Canada has been, in fact, the world leader on all these factors, and still is. But there are other factors. Effective relationship management with all key stakeholders, and here the media play a particular role. Being open and accessible to the media is crucial because their image is transmitted to millions of respondents whose response is conditioned by how they see the agency. Freedom from inappropriate political interference is crucial. And Statistics Canada has been a world leader on these last two elements as well, and I'm worried that it may lose that standing. Now, I said freedom from inappropriate political interference. Is there appropriate political interference? Yes, there is. Clearly, it is entirely appropriate for the government to set the budget of Statistics Canada. What is the amount that this country is willing to spend on official statistics? It's a political decision, should be a political decision, should remain a political decision. What are areas of major government priority is a major input, and it's a valid political interference. We need to know what policies the government is planning, if not the policies, at least what areas it wants to address as a priority, because it's in the public interest that what the government is planning to do should be illuminated with good data available to everybody, so the debate can be about the issues rather than the data. So these are entirely appropriate government inputs or interference, if you want to call it. There is inappropriate interference of a whole sort. The most blatant one, of course, is falsifying reports, and it's not unknown even this day and age. Argentina is very frequently written about, where the government basically said inflation will remain under 10%, and by golly, it is below 10%, whether or not it is. But Greece is another example. The whole financial crisis in Greece is at least partly the result of the fact that over many, many years, Greece was able to hide its underlying economic problems by falsifying its official statistics. A second kind of less blatant, but still pretty bad, inappropriate political interference is not falsifying data, but suppressing them. And that's been well known in communist countries. In fact, the worst example was in the 1930s, there was a census in the Soviet Union, which not only was suppressed, but the head of the statistical office, who wanted to publish them, was actually taken out and shot. Now that was suppression of a pretty bad sort. And even slightly less blatant kind of political interference is manipulating the timing of releases. It's just inconvenient to have high unemployment data being published just before an election, for example, or unfavorable inflation data and so on. Even less bothersome is slanting the accompanying analytic write-up. The data are still valid, but the way you interpret it and publish it is manipulated. And that's quite widespread, I'm afraid, never in Canada, but it's quite widespread even in Western Europe, particularly in countries with decentralized statistical systems where the statistical office is a small corner of a big ministry. The last, and perhaps the least blatant, but nevertheless dangerous form of inappropriate political interference is interfering in methodology. It's the subtlest form, but it matters. Just imagine if the government managed to influence Statistics Canada. I'm not implying even coming close to that now, so I'm not accusing anything because I know it's not the case. But a methodological interference could be, for example, how one weights the inflation data. And it could be highly in the government's interest to shade the weighting of inflation data in such a way that even a fraction of 1% is shaved off the inflation rate, because there is so much money transfer that is dependent on the official inflation measure, that even a fraction of 1% shaved off would save billions of dollars of government expenditure. So these methodological interferences actually do matter. And they never occurred in Canada. There never was even an attempt to influence Statistics Canada until the summer of 2010. Now, in 2010, and I maintain the decision about the long form is an interference in a technical issue. Why is it a technical issue? Is it not a value issue? Of course, there is an underlying value element to the decision on privacy grounds. But the government had tools that it could use legitimately without interfering in methodology if it felt that certain questions shouldn't be on the long form. It approves the census questions. It could have said, no, that question is not appropriate for the census, let's take it out. Nobody would have said a word. That was a very legitimate, would have been a very legitimate approach to what they think is a value issue. On the other hand, to say that a survey should be taken involving 4 million households, an enormous sample size, and it should be published in the great detail that it will be published, is really a methodological decision. I think it's inappropriate for a survey of that size to be taken on a voluntary basis because it cannot support the kind of detailed analysis that will come out which the large sample size is designed to support. The biases will overwhelm the detail. Even if the national totals will be valid or close to valid or appear reasonable, when you break down the information into small communities and small population groups, aboriginals, natives, new immigrants, and so on, particularly for local areas, we will not know what is good and what is bad, even if we can have some overall assessments of the gross numbers. But what is particularly clearly a methodological decision is that this kind of a major change in methodology should be undertaken without testing. It's unprecedented, it's unheard of, it's ridiculous. Statistics Canada never has done a major survey of this kind without the thoroughness of methodological testing. That was not possible and will not be possible. So my main concerns are, in the short run, and really secondarily with the census data and with its unknown but potentially large biases. However, in the long run, what I'm really concerned about is the possibility and the danger of erosion of trust if over time more and more horror stories might come out of biased and clearly indefensible kinds of data for small communities, small groups, where the information can be verified and will be evidently wrong. Now, trust brings me back to the UN principles and their basic motivation. I won't have time to go through all 10 of the basic principles, but the preamble asserts the basic importance of official statistics for, quote, any society that seeks to understand itself and to respect the rights of its members. And then there are 10 principles. The first is just a general statement about impartiality. The second one is critical. And it's not a coincidence that it comes right at the front of the principles. It reads like this. To retain trust in official statistics, the statistical agencies need to decide according to strictly professional considerations, including scientific